countless reasons, Pokemon's visuals, as in the way the games look, have been debated endlessly over the last few years. As the hardware improved, the visuals didn't evolve enough to match that standard. A series that once pushed its hardware to the limit now looks worse than other games running on that same system. I mean, normally that would be fine, but when you combine that with the amount of removed features, what we're left with are big, empty worlds that feel more like a tech demo rather than a living region. Sure, its graphics have improved, but the irony is, the games as a whole feel lower quality, not just visually, but in gameplay. But the more I looked into this, the more I realized it's not just as simple as good or bad graphics. The real question is, should this even be the direction Pokemon is going? But what are bad graphics? Is this bad? Are these bad? What about this? Well, to simplify this, the real determining factor between objectively good or bad graphics is how well the visuals serve their purpose, as in what they are trying to portray. With a game like Mario or Sonic, we need to know where the character is at all times. So they do this by standing out from the background, using thick outlines of defined pixels. Due to the way they are rendered, be that the animation, colors, and effects, we know the motion the player character is portraying, and more importantly, what the enemies are conveying. Now, if we cut to the 3D iterations of those two, while there are way more objectively better things about the 3D counterparts, smoke effects, grass, speed lines, these elements all having higher pixel sizes, however, more doesn't necessarily mean better. Just because there's more on screen does not make the game's graphics better. By having this higher fidelity game, there is way less consistency. This due to opening the game up for more possibilities, as then it means it must adhere to those possibilities. A game using tiny pixel squares can easily keep that consistent, but the more the graphics tech improves, the more the art style has to be curated. Proportions, color palette, animations, in one style can't easily cross over to the other. And I'm not just talking about converting an old game into a new medium, as even building a game from the ground up is a completely different method of creating a game for 2D than it is for 3D. What was once a split-second decision with a click of the mouse now have a lot more decisions to be made. Not only more thought about art style, but if it fits the rest of the model. And then how does lighting affect it? Does it need to be optimized for the engine? All this stuff overall taking way more time to create. What this boils down to is a lot more of the staff at Game Freak that were making 2D games then went on to work on the 3D games. And while Diamond and Pearl started with them playing with these 3D environments, having to improve on that 3D each generation, as well as sticking to the same standards as the 2D games, as in the 8 gym structure, including all past Pokemon, as well as moves, items, and types, resulted in a lack of consistent improvements like the previous games had. And because of this, the newer Pokemon games don't have this consistent improvement, and really starts to become apparent when steps back are taken. Not only in the amount of Pokemon, moves, and fights being inconsistent, but now the frame rate, resolution, and core assets also having these inconsistencies, also cramming in the bare minimum of the amount of elements that came before. And this is why we keep seeing these spin-offs. These games give Game Freak this wiggle room to cut or keep as much as they want. Be that an empty field that now fits because it's from centuries ago, or cutting it down just to focus on one large city, so they can give as much polish they can to it. But again, if I go back to consistency, these still really aren't consistent. While some areas can look amazing, with them using higher texture resolutions, models with more polygons, and more NPCs filling out these smaller areas. It being almost day and night with the previous mainline game. However, it is inconsistent with its own style, and this consistency in graphics is so important. Without it, it creates small or large breaks in a player's immersion. That break in immersion ruining every other facet of the game. But for comparison, the Pokemon games with a smaller pixel count have a consistent frame rate, resolution, and style. And because of this, our minds are able to adapt to it, getting to a point where the player isn't just seeing pixels moving around on the screen, rather starting to view the game as its own entity. As you play these games, you start to understand the visual language. A house being as big as a tree, the player being the same size as a massive Pokemon, and rooms expanding once you enter a house. As long as the rules are set, our minds start to accept it, and even allow players to invest themselves in the game's world. But with these inconsistencies, this can be visually, audibly, and even tonally inconsistent, and that's when the immersion is broken. The thing is, for games, they are mostly abstract from reality already. And when a game keeps that abstraction consistent, a player's brain adapts, as the things on screen aren't competing with any preconceived image of how something in the real world is supposed to look, allowing abstract games to get away with way more than what these less abstract games are trying to do. But what is an abstraction? Well, we know what these graphics are trying to convey, but they're not exactly one-to-one or even realistic. They're these abstractions from our own reality. However, the problem is when this consistency in abstraction starts to break, it creates different kinds of abstractions of different realities, looking like elements should be in different games, rather than a cohesive game world. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but depends on what the game is trying to go for. And because they're in 3D, it's way easy to fail this consistent abstraction with things like frame rate, poly count, and texture quality. The thing is, it's not just pixel art good, 3D bad either. It's because pixel art is abstract already. And then there's the fact that there's a finite amount of pixels on screen that is playing a massive part of this, and sort of why players can accept it way more. An example of this working and not working is already in the 2D Pokemon games. If you look at how the versus screen works, we are already at a weird angle of the characters. So seeing these images presented overlaid on top like this can be sort of gotten away with. However, in that same game, I feel the immersion is slightly broken when using the X transceiver. The sprite resolution is way bigger than both of the in-game ones, and because it isn't really abstract anymore, where the small sprites could cover up the lack of movement, these bigger ones are basically static images. And then they're on screen for long periods of time. Not to mention, we've already seen these characters fully animated in 3D as well, so the visual rules they've set up are being constantly broken, and rules are the key to keeping something consistent. As to go back to the 3D games, Legends Arceus doesn't even have a set texture resolution for individual character models. But again, this can't just be called bad graphics, as can be seen working with some characters. While it sticks out for logos and emblems, it looks intentional and stylized to have these lower quality textures next to higher ones like this, as it's similar to how an artist would render a painting. Some bits would have these tiny details, while other areas just seem to be blobs on a page. And I bring this up because even with limitations, be that on a hardware level or an artistic one, a game in better hands can still overcome those limitations. Once the rules are set up, as long as the game keeps to those rules, the player can and will accept pretty much anything. And this is where games like Scarlet and Violet come in, as they don't technically have consistently bad graphics, and they never really have consistently bad anything. The game looks pretty good sometimes, but it's because of this inconsistency that makes Scarlet and Violet's lacking visuals the most apparent out of any other game. A clear-cut example of this is at the start of the game, as after you create your character, you see this. But then you see this right after. The scene updating using the lower quality model for a split second. Shadows not rendering until later. Even T-posing for a tiny little second here creates this disconnect. There could be an argument here if the graphics look like this, as it doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but when they pop in with higher quality versions of the same model, it breaks the rules that it's trying to set up and undermines whether something looks better or worse when that very same game is wanting to use these higher quality assets. A lower frame rate could be seen as stylistic, but can't be when it's in the same room as higher frame rate characters, but then put next to static slideshows. And again, this is kind of the reason why people say it's got bad graphics. Before we get into the technical side, let's kind of go back to that definition of good and bad graphics. These are whether the thing is conveying what the game creator has set out to create. For games, this is usually being to clearly show what's happening on screen. And while one is lower fidelity, it more clearly and at a faster pace conveys what the player needs to see. And fidelity doesn't necessarily mean good or bad either, as while in the remake here, the fidelity is higher. But if we look to the original, this lack of fidelity gives it a way different feel. And I'm sure a feel that was closer to what the original developers were trying to capture. But the thing is, the one on the left probably tried to go for something like this, but because of the higher resolution, more pixels could be seen. So to make up for that, these developers working on remakes for games usually compensate by adding more. But again, in the process, completely changed the look the original was going for. And I kind of cheated using the pixel art example at the start. As well, it does carry everything over I said, it's quite a defiantly different style to 3D, while these remakes look super close to each other. But the point I'm trying to make is it's necessary to have these changes, as techniques used on lower fidelity games doesn't work as well with a game that has a higher one. Have you ever seen those HD re-releases where they just make the textures and resolution higher? Everything just sort of looks off. I mean, they're fine, but you can see that the techniques they were using in the original aren't giving the same effect as in the new one, due to the higher fidelity. So this is why remakes have all these new details to them. But this concept still works within a pixel art example. As while it's not one big leap from 2D to 3D, what can work in lower fidelity pixel art Pokemon games can't work in a higher fidelity one. And this is the same with the 3D Pokemon games. Some games do the complete opposite, making the style even simpler, as to not compete with what came before. This is going to age way better than other remakes, but it's completely lost the charm of the original, and has sort of been brought closer to the style most games in that genre use. But games in that genre have this style due to this fidelity, as a HD re-release of this would look really odd, as the purposefully muddy texture work, which looks great on Wii, loses more than it gains by having these higher textures. So in turn, needs to add these details and any other stuff to make it look visually consistent inconsistent. And I show these examples because Pokemon has done all of these things mentioned. Let's Go feels like the next step of those early 3D graphics, while Sword and Shield feel like the next step of Sun and Moon's graphics. Thing is, they also have the new remake graphics that completely changed what the original was going for, similar to the Sonic example I gave at the start. This isn't inherently better, as again, even more variables have to be accounted for. Lighting, poly count, shadows, and I feel this is where Game Freak is going wrong. The newer games visually look good in areas, but since the game is going for more realistic proportions with intense details on characters, AZ, and to more of an extent Scarlet and Violet, also have to spread that out to the rest of the game. And they fail at this, as the game has these really open and empty spaces, which would work if the other assets were also less detailed. And due to this, it makes the game look unfinished. And since the game looks unfinished, subconsciously we view these spaces we're put in as these in-between worlds, not stylized enough to believe the player character has to conform to the world constraints and the rules set up by the game's world, but they're also not realistic enough to treat it as a functional, believable world. Going back to one of the primary reasons of a game's fidelity as to clearly communicate something to the player, the way most of the graphics are constructed, objectively, are not doing that as well as the games that came before. Now, a lot of these graphic problems lend to the type of game it is, and the type of game it is lends to the hardware, but then the hardware sort of loops back to what graphics are being used. So if you want an open world game on Switch, it can look like this, or it can look like this. Now this is putting it simply, as there's a lot of tricks to manage a game like this, but the performance of these mainline Pokemon games affect the immersion a lot. Big cities with nothing in them, Pokemon popping in, frame rate drops, draw distance. The way they have constructed these open parts of the game is fundamentally flawed. While there are frame drops in other games, like Breath of the Wild or Dragon Quest, it's when these players are just walking or riding with nothing happening, we see these frame drops or freezes. The thing is, again, the direct comparison are in these same games, as these few places show off a good use of composition, world building, and consistent detail, all at a steady frame rate. But it's more when the player gets to these barren, lifeless areas, with Pokemon coming out of nowhere, with the frame rate dropping every 2 seconds, it starts to add up. You see, there's a name for this unrealistic look, as in this weird in-between worlds the Pokemon graphics have, this being the Uncanny Valley effect. This is mostly seen with humans, but the same thing applies to the Pokemon game's environments. As it tries to become more real, it starts to come off more fake. One side of this has graphics so abstract, our brains can't possibly mistake it as real life. But on the other side, our graphics so close to reality that our brains don't really have a problem with it, emulating reality just enough for the player to comfortably accept and be able to focus on the gameplay. This inconsistency in rules also plays into this too, as in those games with higher texture resolutions and photorealistic graphics, if an inconsistency or glitch happens, the player's immersion is broken. Compared to that of a lower fidelity game, it's not really a big deal, but in a more realistic game, it's hard not to focus on. And all of this is the same for Pokemon. As the games get closer to real life every game, these filters are slowly corroded away, leaving the player no choice but to accept what it is for what it is. And what it is a 3D model jumping up and down with a 2D overlay effect covering up a 3D asset being converted to another 3D asset on a 40-inch 1080p screen.
Where will your adventure take you?
Ready to catch, battle, and trade.
Adventures and worlds to explore.
The thing is, with games now, you can't follow the rules that worked before, and also expect them to follow this Uncanny Valley graph. This works in older games because not only is it an abstraction of a character, but it's a lower fidelity one, as well as being on a smaller screen. Because of this, rather than objects, people, and places, this becomes ideas and concepts of them. This isn't a Pokemon town, but only a representation of one. Sort of like you're looking at a map. Houses, flowers, and roads aren't that big in real life. I mean, the whole town couldn't work in real life, but as you know, our brains ignore this, and anything else like a frame drop or glitch, because it's only an abstraction version of the Pokemon world, our brains sort of let it slide, our imagination filling in the gaps between the screen and our brain. And now looking at how Game Freak has rendered the world in these newer titles, it's now starting to fall into this Uncanny Valley. NPCs don't always emote, every Poke Center or house interior sort of looks the same, these all stick out to a player when it didn't before. And again, these all have direct comparisons of them being done well in that same game. The textures are another element of this, and so it adds to this uncanny valley effect that the games have. The problem is there being lower quality textures, models, and animations next to high quality textures and animations also breaks this immersion. Like even good looking games like the Final Fantasy VII remake have this problem, as they're trying to push the hardware in places that counts, but in turn devaluing the quality overall when the player gets a glance or goes into an area that the developers think doesn't count as much. And while these textures are higher quality than anything in the pixel art Pokemon games, this lack of pixels overall sort of acts like a blur when you're playing. This, tied with how small the screens are for older consoles, shows in this example how blurring and pixelating can hide the liminality of this room, but putting it in a higher texture resolution makes the location feel less real somehow. So whereas before our minds could accept this, now that's how a lot of the locations feel, less real. Again, blurred, they look fine, but because it's the fidelity they're at that makes it come across like this. And that's what I was trying to get at with the Xenoblade example. The blur of the first one makes it look like a finished painting, whereas the other one with these really sharp looking textures that on their own look good for the characters, but set up in a scene like this, your eye doesn't know where to be drawn to first. Hopefully this is making sense, but your eyes feel more relaxed in the first image, while in the second, your eyes are constantly scanning due to this extra detail, and makes the whole thing look way more liminal. Higher texture resolution basically means more pixels. And the thing is, the size of the pixels means you have less opportunities to mess up here, while a game with a lot of pixels has a lot of space to look bad. Not to mention, a player can now walk up and zoom into these areas, revealing how low fidelity things really are. And this is not always on purpose. The player can stop in any of these areas, maybe to pause or to get their bearings, and depending on where they're stood, start to see these low poly elements. What this does, when you take the other assets out, like NPCs or Pokemon, you start to see how liminal these spaces really are. And even before, they were devoid of any real life. This is because the objects and assets that have been chosen to be rendered haven't had enough time put into them. And this isn't as if the game has not loaded everything yet, like seen in other games. These assets were created just to look like that. Unlike past games where we had one set angle, the player can now position it so they can see every side of an object. Those liminal space games you see on Steam understand this, as they usually use locations that are easy to render, like a blank room or something that has specifically no real defining features, as so a human can assign things to them. You can't even see the player character in this one. And hey look, they have that heavy filtering to make the resolution look lower fidelity, and this is all on purpose. But when these same games try to use a location that needs to have more of these details, but not enough time has been put into rendering them, this illusion breaks, now falling again down this uncanny valley. And the same goes for Pokemon, as most of the interiors of the Pokemon games work. As a man-made location like this might look a bit weird if there's nothing in it, but because an empty location like this can exist, it's not too much of a stretch on the imagination that they do exist. But especially in a Pokemon game like this doesn't transfer when doing a more realistic location. Again, while a grassy field and blue sky can exist, it's completely different than the blank room example. In a blank room, the wall can have basically no detail, and because the carpet and flooring are made by a machine, the pattern that it has is a perfectly even one. This is contrast with an outside environment where pretty much everything has a level of randomness, as most things in nature are non-man-made, meaning they don't have this uniformity. And absolutely in some angles, the game can appear kind of appealing. But it's because the camera is at one of these optimal angles, meaning if you break that, say you get too close, or with the water example, too far, this illusion is broken again. And these games do have to put up with being at any angle now. In contrast with, say, the town scene in Sword and Shield, or even the old pixel art games where they can control everything the player sees. So it's not exactly like this is a hardware issue either. Again, when you see direct comparison is when you start to see this stuff stand out. But why does it look like this? Well, one of Game Freak's technical artists, Kenichi Maizawa, actually spoke about the graphics of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. He explained that the team wanted to make the generation look more realistic than previous work, focusing on the texture and shape of the background. But because Pokemon and human characters aren't meant to look completely real, they tried to explore how to integrate those two worlds. In short, they were trying to chase realism while trying to stay stylized, and that's where the inconsistencies creep in. I could talk more about this, but it's not necessary to know, so I'll put it on screen, but the full document's in the description. immersion. They added systems like dynamic dirt accumulation when walking on different terrains, subsurface scattering for Pokemon skin, and this fake translucency for slime or gel parts of a Pokemon. But again, the more complex the model, the more room there is for something to look wrong. Every lighting condition, every camera angle, every shadow, it all needs to match perfectly. And when it doesn't, the whole illusion falls apart. So even though Scarlet and Violet are technically doing more than ever before, that more ends up exposing the inconsistency even further. Because Pokemon's world, at its core, was never meant to be realistic, but it was meant to be believable. So Miyazawa's talk proves that Game Freak isn't ignoring visuals, but rather overcomplicating them. What Pokemon really needs isn't more texture maps or lighting passes, it needs a stronger visual identity, one that sets clear rules and sticks to them. It's a simple fact of taking time to polish these parts of the world, testing whether these assets match each other, checking to see if they look good at all angles they can be seen from, and then optimizing them within the engine. So for example, if we go over this, there's the obvious ones of adding the correct shadows or matching the texture resolutions. These don't even need to be done, as the game could also use foliage to hide a lot of this stuff. Even with the assets that are already in there, the game could also just slightly alter their implementation, using the exact same amount of polygons say for the grass, but by angling them and still retaining the original blades, we can make the grass seem more randomized than how the straight line effect they were going for. This can be super subtle, but it's these small details that can take it away from this more liminal space look. Another thing can be the water within the games. What the past games did was use this UV map blending. This is to save on memory, with it only using one texture. But then warping it with a texture sampling technique like this can fix this repeating texture look, and a lot of those HD mods actually use this. The great thing is, this can be combined with the UV map blending to work with the water. And from the Miyazawa talk, and just looking at the game, unlike Legends Arceus, we can see Scarlet and Violet using a similar thing, but again, it's diminished by the other assets. Actually, if you read most of the signs in the game, they clearly paint a different picture than what is actually being shown. As the thing is, it's hard to imagine what something should look like, as these graphics can't really be called bad if there's no comparison to them, as we only have these graphics in a specific art style to look at, as while similar are not the same as AZ's, so we can't simply compare them. But interestingly enough, that whole Game Freak presentation is extremely valuable and shows what we could have got. Now, while basically a blend of in-game and concept art, this puts into perspective what the people complaining about the graphics are actually complaining for. A player gets such a sense of mystery and adventure from this one image. Not knowing what's ahead makes you want to explore even more, whereas this doesn't so much. But if we see how much is being rendered already as a picture starts to be painted as to the reasons why we didn't get the image you're seeing. Scarlet and Violet used a lot of techniques that strive to make this Pokemon game look more realistic, as to contend with other games on the platform. But all these tricks start to add up, and it takes a lot of processing power, meaning to load all of these things would start to create problems in other areas. Again, loading, pop-ins, and then those lack of small details makes me think Game Freak's finally started to understand this now, as AZ does a great job at creating a realistic and believable city. But it's because it's only a city, these labyrinthian buildings and sectioned off areas are the reason for the step up in graphics, rather than Game Freak finally finding out how to make a better looking game. But as we can see in some areas, the graphics aren't better. They had more time to spend on them, but with factors like leaving textures in and not giving these buildings enough depth starts to break this abstraction again. And with AZ, that's why you're seeing people complain. Again, it's hard to speculate on why these problems arise, but when the code like this gets dumped after a new release, you really get a look behind the curtain. Now, I'm going to be careful what I show on screen, but here's one of the leaked development screenshots that I've cropped. And as we can see, the balconies that are flat textures in the game were fully 3D at some point. So these are obviously not a stylized choice, as they even had them in X and Y. But all of this you're seeing starts to come into question of what Game Freak's overall skill level is. Now, with all these Pokemon leaks that keep happening, I don't know what I can and can't show, but I can describe small things like thousands of assets dumped in single directories, scripts mixed across unrelated subfolders, identical trainer models being reused in Sun and Moon's files, or them using separate models for shiny Pokemon instead of calling in different textures. And while not the end of the world, what this showcases are building problems. Over time, the more of these, the bigger the game gets, it can get out of control very fast, as they're building new games on top of old code, as some of the legacy code is going back 15 years. These issues explain why graphics sometimes feel half-finished, why performance struggles despite simple visuals, and why development seems slow or inconsistent. And what this does is send the games into a completely different direction rather than expanding on what came before. The games feeling like different iterations rather than refinements. Like I said, the company started with 2D games in mind, and even those have problems. The thing is, with the 2D games, they got better with every game. However, this design jump from pixel art sprites to fully 3D models for everything, it also meant they had to leave behind what they had learned from those past titles, as well as hire a lot more staff, which is not necessarily a bad thing. However, from what we know of Game Freak as a company, from public information like interviews or job review websites, we can see Game Freak is outsourcing more and more help from other companies each year. And what this type of contract work can result in is these workers learn the engine, but then are not brought on to work on the next games, only being hired out for a specific segment of the game. The biggest piece of evidence being the Polygon interview for Sword and Shield, or this 2019 Game Informer interview, or even on their own website where Tetsuya Watanabe states he doesn't have a concrete image of an ideal development team, but him and Masuda has made it clear in the past that they want to keep the team small, which is honestly the right call. Having more staff means each member will have their own way of doing things. No matter how small of a part, it adds to this level of inconsistency. But while Game Freak has it right in theory, in practice, the way the games are made are actually making the need for way more members. So that's why they end up outsourcing anyway. But like mentioned, not keeping them on through to the next game, even though they'll still need that same manpower. So because of this, nothing's being solved unless they downsize the game's scope or make their extremely fast release cycle longer. And that's where we see this release cycle change, as actually now the games are getting longer to be made. And while now also making smaller games that are more like individual experiences between the mainline games. Whereas Game Freak of the past wanted to produce a Pokemon game every year, this leaving the games with a very short development cycle. But another reason might be because Game Freak aren't fully focusing on Pokemon. From past interviews, Game Freak divides themselves into two separate teams. Team 1 has a system in place that they call the Gear Project, which essentially means that any team member can pitch an idea, but this pertains only to the Gear Project team and does not cross over to Team 2, which would be the Pokemon team. And I think the Gear Project is a really interesting idea, as it incentivizes creativity among the team, as certain employees are allotted time for any prototypes, concept art, or gameplay ideas. Harmonite, Pocket Card Jockey, Tembo the Badass Elephant, Giga Wrecker, and Little Town Hero have all been made due to this Gear Project. And Game Freak's newest endeavor, with Beast of Reincarnation, shows that they're still creating new IP from this Gear Project. As another reason this Gear Project is set up may be due to Game Freak not fully owning the IP to Pokemon, as it's actually split between Creatures Inc., Nintendo, and Game Freak. But what this means for Game Freak is basically a small pool of employees are taken away from the mainline Pokemon games to work on these other titles. Again, this isn't a bad thing in concept, but during the development of Sword and Shield, they had doubled their team size to 200 from the 100 that were working on Sun and Moon. And during this, Giga Wrecker was also in development. So even on top of the Gear Project, they're working on two Pokemon games at once. And there seems to be a lot of overlap between these projects. So what that means is even though they're improving each game, we can't actually see the implementation of any of the improvements they made in those previous games, as they're working on them at the same time. But clearly after this many entries like this, while the core game concept is great, everything around it isn't really matching up to the same standards. And I still don't think Game Freak's ready for a production cycle like this. While the new games feel like the next step not only for the series, but for the ambition of the team making it, they're just too many factors that's stopping it from reaching its full potential. As for Game Freak, these small issues in the grand scheme of things comes down to their ambition with what game they're trying to make, as well as also wanting to make different games apart from Pokemon, all sort of wrapped up in this time limit they're trying to make multiple games under. So while it's great to see so many games with the Pokemon title coming out, at its core, it's not Pokemon, and I don't really think Pokemon has been Pokemon for a while now. This is not really the video to get into this topic, but if I think Pokemon's not Pokemon and it's such a bad game now, why am I even pointing this stuff out? Well, there's a reason why it sells millions, and it's not the graphics, but it's the fact that the core concepts of the games are done really well. It's essentially a JRPG with hundreds of party members to choose from without the need of explaining dialogue as to why they joined the party, while also having a reason on why the player controls their actions. Losing has lasting permanence in the world, and the type system is set up in a way where it's easy to understand, but balanced enough by allowing the player to only have 6 Pokemon, in which their types can't cover every element, supporting variety, however can be strategized in a way to cover each of the weaknesses with one of the 4 moves that each Pokemon can have, while also having a lot of accessibility with the turn-based system of those battles. And the battles kind of play out like chess with the added factor of accuracy, which improves that type of gameplay by a losing opponent being able to get the upper hand by using riskier moves, unlike in chess, where you just have to surrender at some point. And this is all constructed and taught through the goal of beating trainers with specific types, these being the gyms placed around the map, creating this natural exploration of the world while also pushing the player to not use the same strategy against each one. That naturally pushing the player to naturally balance their team accordingly. And now we have that explanation. You can see why I like the core game so much. And so, what should Game Freak do next? Well, I believe one game got that balance right.
ポケットモンスターブラックホワイト
The reason they got it so right was because these developers had been working with these pixel art games for over a decade. These games in the 5th generation had mastered the balance. While the graphics were consistent, rather than stick to one medium, these games conveyed their story and characters through whatever was necessary. Unlike the next generations like X and Y or Sun and Moon, because of this art style and then being in the medium of pixel art, and while they still use 3D, they now come off timeless. But this video is getting a little bit long, so I'll save that whole spiel for the next video. But the question is, what would the next step of a game like that look like?